Several decades ago, a collaborative group of Jewish and Christian scholars based in Israel advanced what was then, and still is, considered a radical theory regarding the birth, growth, and development of the Synoptic Gospels. What began as a joint effort between two Jerusalem-based scholars, American Robert L. Lindsay, a Southern Baptist minister, and Professor David Flusser, director of the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, blossomed into a fledgling movement and spawned what came to be known as the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Research. Lindsay had originally noticed that the Gospel of Luke, though said to lack Aramaisms, can be translated into a Hebrew text much more easily than Mark, which is almost universally assumed to have been the first of the four Gospels. For example, Mark frequently interjects the Greek expression kephthis and immediately. He does this a total of 41 times, yet the phrase has no Hebrew equivalent. Luke, by contrast, employs the expression only once, and not in a story unit shared with Mark. Lindsay's question was that if Luke were copying Mark, who had supposedly wrote first, why did he not reproduce Mark's wording, kephthis? He concluded that Luke did not copy Mark's text because he did not see it. Matthew, in a number of instances, reproduces kephthis, but only in passages which parallel Mark. A test of other expressions and phrases yielded similar results. Moreover, Lindsay discovered that in places where Matthew most closely follows Mark, his text does not translate well into Hebrew. However, when Matthew follows Luke as opposed to Mark, it's relatively easy to render a Hebrew version of the narrative. Lindsay was forced to conclude that Luke had indeed wrote first. When he met David Flusser, who had independently become convinced of the strong editorial redaction in Mark's Gospel, a healthy working relationship began. They suggested that beneath the Greek texts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke lay a long-vanished Semitic, indeed a Hebrew subtext or undertext, a Grundschrift, the haunting tones of which may be imperfectly glimpsed through the occasionally awkward syntax of the traditional gospel narratives. As a literary product, the Gospels betray their origins, not as a collection of oral compositions slapped together by Greek-speaking redactors decades after the life and death of their principal subject, but as a multi-layered translation project, dissecting, rearranging, reassembling, and parroting what theoretically began as a single Hebraic document, a hypothetical life of Jesus of Nazareth. The evidence for such an undertext is hiding in plain sight in the multiple Hebraisms, that is, Greek words and phrases which almost certainly represent translations of Hebrew idioms, scattered across the synoptic narratives. Syntactical evidence in the form of sentence structure that appears to mimic biblical Hebrew is equally abundant. Indeed, the Greek of the Synoptic Gospels is said to resemble what might be called translation Greek, similar to the ancient Greek rendering of the Hebrew Scriptures, known as the Septuagint. Language of composition being the fundamental element of any literary work, the implications of this avant-garde theory are astounding. They suggest that the Christian Gospels are inherently the product of homegrown Jewish thought during the days of the Second Temple. Moreover, they present us with the serious prospect that the language in which the words of the historical Jesus were recorded, and by extension, the mother tongue in which he taught, was not, as long supposed, Aramaic, but Hebrew. Hardly a dead or dormant language, this was the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and subsequently the Mishnah. In a real sense, the Jesus of history becomes Jesus, the Jewish sage. Some have argued that Aramaic source material of some kind lay behind the Synoptic Gospels, while others have argued just as convincingly that the Aramaic theory is without merit. The case presented here is that looking to the proposed Aramaic sources behind the Synoptics is in fact seriously flawed. There are certainly several Aramaisms peppering the Gospel narratives, including Talitakumi in Mark 5:41, Ephata in Mark 7:34, Rabboni in Mark 10:51, and most notably, Eloi, Eloi, lima sabachthani in Mark 15:34. It's significant, however, that most Hebrew literature from the Second Temple and Tannaitic periods, including the Mishnah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Bar Kokhba letters, also contain Aramaisms that had filtered into common use. It's equally notable that multiple Hebrew words are also represented in the Greek Gospels. These include Libanon, or Levona in Hebrew, meaning frankincense, Matthew 2:11. Rakah, same pronunciation in Hebrew, meaning empty, Matthew 5:22. Rabbi, or Rav in Hebrew, meaning rabbi, Matthew 23:7 and 8. Kuminon, or Kamon in Hebrew, meaning kumin, Matthew 23:23. Korban, same pronunciation in Hebrew, meaning sacrifice, Mark 7:11. Satanan, or Satan in Hebrew, Satan, Luke 10:18. Beelzebul, or Baal-Zevuv in Hebrew, Beelzebub, Luke 11:15. Mammona, or Mammon, Mammon in Hebrew, Luke 16:9. Uai, or Oi in Hebrew, woe, and Amen, appearing hundreds of times in the Gospels. In the early 20th century, the renowned Jewish scholar M.H. Segal wrote, "What was the language of ordinary life of educated native Jews in Jerusalem and Judea from 40 BC to 150 AD? The evidence presented by Mishnaic Hebrew and its literature leaves no doubt that that language was Mishnaic Hebrew. Of course, those educated Judeans also understood Aramaic and used it even in writing, but only occasionally." As recently observed by Michael Weiss in his study of language patterns in Roman Judea, most scholars today would agree that Judeans in the 1st century CE and the first third of the 2nd century were a trilingual society, using Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. He also notes that prior to the discoveries of the manuscripts of the Judean desert between 1945 and 1965, it was commonly assumed that the dominant language for daily life in Judea was Aramaic. However, it was the discoveries associated with the later period, the contracts and documents of the Bar Kokhba period, that provided the more direct argument for Hebrew as a vernacular, and it was the letters that advanced this view. In the final analysis, those who insist that the Greek of the Synoptics does not rely on Hebrew source material of any kind are forced to conclude that in the many instances in which the Greek seems to betray a Hebraic flavor, such as, "and it came to pass," the writers were deliberately attempting to mimic biblical Hebrew, something not done with such regularity in John's Gospel or the other Greek compositions of the New Testament. The other logical option is they were, in fact, relying on authentically Hebraic source texts, subsequently translated to Greek. Indeed, those who cannot hear the rich resonance of Hebrew coursing through the printed words of the Greek text are arguably not sufficiently trained in Hebrew to appreciate the phenomenon. The burden of this research is to read through the Greek of the Synoptic Gospels to the vestigial remnants of this underlying Hebraic source. It's a monumental undertaking of scholarly sleuthing, which seeks to reconstruct this most elusive of all undertexts, vaguely akin to a Dead Sea Scroll, some 30 to 35 Hebrew chapters in length, and likely reduced to writing within just a few years of the events it describes. According to the Jerusalem School, this text, which was subsequently lost, was translated to Greek for consumption in the Hellenistic communities to the west, where the Apostle Paul was busily casting his own theological net over this uniquely Jewish messianic sect. For the sake of scholarship, it may be referred to as a proto-narrative, or PN. The obvious question is how this single undertext became 3 separate synoptic accounts. That's a question we need to explore much more deeply. Stay tuned.